I'm Michael Heidinger for Radio St. Rose, and today I'll be speaking about DNA testing companies with Blaine Bettinger, an intellectual property attorney who runs the website The Genetic Genealogist. Let's start with your background. How did you become interested in both genetics and genealogy?
Actually, my interest in genealogy began probably 25 years ago in a middle school assignment. We were asked to fill out a family tree, and I started and have not stopped since. So I've been using traditional genealogy research techniques for quite a while. And then approximately 10 or 11 years ago, I first learned of the use of DNA for genealogy. And at the time, I was actually a graduate student who was working in genetics. And I felt that the marriage of two things that I enjoyed was a perfect fit. So I sent away for my first genetic genealogy test and have been interested in writing about the field ever since.
And what was the company's name, the first test?
The first company was it was a DNA print, it was called. And it was one of the first companies that was looking at autosomal DNA. So this wasn't actually a Y-DNA or a mitochondrial DNA test. This was looking at, I think it was less than 200 SNPs in the genome, or locations in the genome, to try to give an ethnicity percentage. And it was a very early test, a very rough estimate, but soon after that I then went to testing at family tree DNA and did a Y-DNA test.
Okay, and before we get too far into this, just for a general audience, what would you consider the basics that people need to know to understand this? I mean, you've already brought up the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA.
Well, there's three major different types of DNA testing currently on the market. Two that have been around for quite a while now, 13, 14 years, and that's the Y-DNA and the mitochondrial DNA. Now, the Y-DNA is a chromosome that makes a male a male. So only males have a Y chromosome. What's interesting about that is that it's passed down from only father to son, which means that if you were to plot, if you're a male and you plot your Y-DNA on your genealogical tree, what you'll see is it follows the same line as your surname. So the Y-DNA and the surname are often very closely tied together. And that can really be advantageous for genealogical research. For example, if your surname line hits a wall, or you're adopted, for example. So Y-DNA is really a great tool for genetic genealogists. Now, on the mirror side of that genealogical tree is the maternal line, or your mother's 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 line. And interestingly, there's a piece of DNA that's associated with that particular line called your mitochondrial DNA. And mitochondrial DNA is passed down only from mother to child. That's slightly different than Y-DNA, which only goes from father to son. But here it goes from mother to all her children, but it stops with each male. So I inherited my mother's mitochondrial DNA, but I won't pass it on to my children. My sister will pass it on to her children, for example. So again, if you plot it on your genealogical tree, you'll see it follows your mother's 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 line, or your maternal line. And so, again, that can be advantageous for genealogists because often, as genealogists know, tracing your mother's family can be very difficult. Your maternal lines can sometimes be very difficult, just because of the way documents and the way society was set up during historical times. So Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA, as I said, have been around for quite some time. The third type of testing is relatively new, only being about 5 years old or so, and that is autosomal DNA. So that's all the rest of the DNA that we didn't talk about, and it's actually the vast majority of the DNA that makes up a person. And these autosomal tests will look at 1 million locations or more scattered throughout that those billions and billions of locations, looking for information that can be used for a couple of different things. The first is, as I discussed earlier, which was the ethnicity percentage, or trying to tie certain sequences of DNA to regions of the world. So, for example, if I have a certain sequence at a certain location, and that sequence is more commonly found in Europe, for example, then that suggests that that segment of DNA came from Europe, from European ancestors. And that's used for more large-scale groupings, such as continental locations like Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, South America, things like that. There is beginning to be some refinement into areas like Northern Europe, Southern Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, locations like that. And those are continuously being refined and formed. So that's a very, very new area of genetic genealogy. Now, one of the other uses of autosomal DNA is to find genetic cousins. So what companies will do is take your results and compare those results segment by segment to everyone else in their database. And if you share a big enough segment or enough numbers of segments with another person, then that suggests that you are related. And depending on how big the segments are and how many there are, it can be used as a very rough approximation of how closely you're related. If you share a huge percentage of your DNA, you'll be much more closely related than if you share just one or two segments. And these companies use algorithms that help them predict whether or not two people are related, and then make a prediction about how closely they're related. So when you get your results back, you'll get a list of other people and then a predicted relationship between those two people. It's then up to you to try to find your shared ancestor. And that's where a lot of the difficulty in these tests come, in trying to find a common ancestor. But for genealogists, that's a lot of the fun as well.
Speaking of these DNA testing companies, a few of the more prominent ones are 23andMe.com, National Geographic has their Genographic project, the website Ancestry.com also features a DNA service. How many of these companies are you actually familiar with and have you tested with?
I've actually, I would add another one to that family tree DNA, and I've tested all four of those companies.
And how would you compare them with the results and what services they offer? And
you know, what's interesting is that each of them offers something slightly different. For example, 23andMe offers health and trait information with your results that the other companies don't offer. So, for example, it'll look at certain propensities for disease like diabetes, Alzheimer's, things like that, as well as traits such as hair color, eye color, numerous other traits and conditions. None of the other companies offer that. Family tree DNA's test, for example, is very strongly populated by genealogists, which means that the people who take those tests are typically interested in interacting with you and sharing information with you, which is a benefit. At 23andMe, that can sometimes be a challenge for people who are not as interested in genealogy but are more interested in taking the test for health reasons. Ancestry.com is an interesting platform because it will automatically compare your uploaded family tree to your matches family tree in order to try to find, via their computer algorithm, a shared ancestor. So, for people who are Ancestry.com subscribers, you can upload your family tree to Ancestry.com and store it there. And then you can tie it to your account. And if the other person does that, the algorithm will compare your two trees and identify any overlaps. I've had a little bit of success using that offer, and it's been really interesting to see those comparisons. National Geographic, the Genographic Project, is less for identifying genetic cousins and more for the ethnicity calculations. So each company actually has its own pluses and minuses, and it really depends on what you're interested in and what you want to learn about your family history.
And speaking of family history, one of the I've noticed on the discussion boards of 23andme.com, which I've tested with, is that sometimes people learn that, for example, siblings are not actually their siblings, but they are actually half siblings. Or sometimes people find that they're actually adopted because they found that they're not genetically related to the people that they thought were relatives. Have you found any horror stories with that, or do you think people are ready for the results?
Well, that's always a possibility, and I always tell people when I give talks on this subject, I always try to tell people that although DNA tests never lie, families do. So they have to be prepared for DNA testing to reveal secrets that may have been secrets for many years. It could be even generations back, much less your own generation. So it's a possibility, and it's something somebody should be prepared for if they were to purchase a DNA test. Now, I have encountered some situations where people have been surprised by their results. And I think what I've seen anecdotally is an initial surprise, and sometimes someone can be upset, although over time it leads to the individual sort of incorporating that into who they are now and wanting to learn more about it. On the flip side, these DNA tests are more and more being used by people who have known mysteries in their family tree, and are trying to solve those types of mysteries using DNA and their genetic cousins. So what can be a curse for some people, I think, has been a blessing for many more people.
Okay. Another thing that shows up sometimes is that people think that their ancestry is, say, completely European, and they get a test back and they find out, whoa, we've got Asian or African or Native American ancestry. Could you explain that a little bit?
Certainly. So I think a lot of times people, I think it's actually more rare for people to find populations that they weren't expecting than it is for people to find that they don't have the populations they expected. But let me address the first situation, and that's where people don't expect certain populations that they get back. Now, I'll take my own, for example. I received my results back, and I was surprised to find some Native American and some African components. I think I took another look at my family tree, and upon thinking about it, I have a large percentage of my maternal ancestry is from the Honduras and the Caribbean region. And I think it makes sense to have some admixture from that region based on the historical events in that area and the mixing of cultures and populations. And so sometimes it can be simply the result of family history being lost within a couple of generations. Family stories just aren't passed down, I think, as much as they used to be. And so people may have lost the oral history that would have supported the finding that came through their DNA. So I think I would be, what I've found for the most part is people are looking for those types of segments, something to make them less than 100% European. So on the flip side, I think what happens even more often is that people get their results back and they are not what they expect them to be. For example, they have a family story about a Native American ancestor, and that's not reflected in any way in their DNA results. They come back and they're 100% European, for example. And another very important concept for people to understand about genetic genealogy is that we have two family trees. The first is what I call our genealogical tree. And that's the full complement of ancestors. It's every single grandparent, great-grandparent, all the way back through time. Now, we also have what I call our genetic tree. And the genetic tree is a small subset of our genealogical tree. So, of course, our parents are both on our genetic tree, and our grandparents, and our great-grandparents, and so on, for about 4 or 5 generations back. After that, some of our great-grandparents start falling off our genetic tree. And so if your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was Native American, and he just, through random inheritance, happened to not be on your genetic tree, and even though he is on your genealogical tree, he didn't provide any of the DNA you walk around with today, and his ethnicity is not represented in your DNA. So getting your results back and finding that they're 100% European does not mean that your genealogical tree was 100% European. What it means is your genetic tree is 100% European. So it's important to keep in mind those two different trees. And remember that one, the genetic tree, is just a small subset of the genealogical tree.
Okay. Well, in my case, for example, the 23andme.com analysis, I'm mostly European, but I have 0.2% African. There's a little tiny segment on my 6th chromosome. So, with something like that, how far back would we be talking about in the genetic family tree?
Well, that's a good question, because at a certain point, it's very difficult to say how far back, because when a segment is that small, it may be 5 generations back or it may be 50 generations back. It's just so hard to tell. If it were a much larger segment, it would be easier to say that it was a certain number of generations. But once you talk that small, it's much more difficult to predict.
Okay. Yeah, because I haven't found any, indication in the genealogical family tree of anything other than Northern European ancestry. Switching subjects now, one of the would probably be the most surprising thing to a general audience who's not familiar with these tests is the fact that we can now predict Neanderthal ancestry in our DNA.
That's right. I currently believe that it's based in good science, but it's science that's still developing. So it's apt to change over the next couple of years as we learn more about our DNA and more about Neanderthal DNA. So just within the past couple of years, the Neanderthal genome has been sequenced. And by looking at sequences that are more common in Neanderthals than in humans, and then finding those in humans, has led several prominent groups to conclude that Neanderthals and humans interbred when those cultures collided in Europe and or Asia. So using those known sequences, tests such as 23andMe will analyze your results to try to identify those. And then based on that, they can give you a certain percentage of Neanderthal ancestry. And it varies pretty wildly from 0% to 2 or 3%. It rarely goes much higher than, for example, 5%. just because the amount of Neanderthal contribution to our genomes has just become a very small percentage. So it's there, but it's usually a very small amount. So I think it's based on good science. It's just a matter of how much it will change over the next couple of years as we learn more.
Sounds interesting. I look forward to finding out more about that because I have my 23andMe results, and I'm actually I'm waiting for my National Geographic Genographic results. I got an email a couple days ago saying that it was 80% complete, and I understand that they test as well for Neanderthal DNA.
They do, absolutely, yes. They also test for Denisovan, which is another population, another prehistoric population that was discovered in Asia. So it gives you another percentage, and that very similar situation of a tiny fraction of our DNA is provided by that population, and it varies from population to population. So, for example, in Australian Aborigines, for example, there's up to as much as 6% of their DNA is Denisovan. So, it's another interesting population, and again, that one I think is even more apt to change over the next couple of years as we learn more.
Let's see, what is your opinion of, I hope I'm pronouncing this correct, gedmatch.com, which I believe is it's a sort of amateur site for people where they can continue with genetic analysis on their own outside of these companies?
That's right. GEDmatch.
GEDmatch, okay.
Yep. Based on GEDCOMS. That's what it started out, was a site to compare GEDCOMS. So as I said, one of the difficulties with these tests is identifying your shared ancestor. And GEDmatch launched, and GEDmatch is, by the way, a fantastic tool for genetic genealogists. GEDmatch launched as a platform for people to compare their GEDCOMS, which is a format of family trees, and it allowed people to compare them to find any overlap or shared ancestors. Since that time, it's developed and introduced a wide variety of other tools, including ethnicity calculators, phasing tools. So, as you know, everyone has 2 copies of their DNA, and the phasing tool will separate that into the 2 separate segments, which most tests are currently unable to do. It uses information from other family members in order to help do that. But again, there's a wide variety of tools at GEDmatch. Now, one of the concerns of these types of tools, these third-party tools, is privacy issues. And so people should be aware of any type of privacy issue before they go uploading their DNA to third-party sites. I think that's probably somewhat obvious, but it can be very difficult to completely guarantee anonymity in the genomic world. We walk around every day and leave our DNA behind us everywhere we go, and so it can be very challenging to always safeguard our genomes and our identities. So people should be aware of and willing to accept the risk of uploading their DNA results to a third-party site.
Okay.
That being said, I think it's a fantastic tool.
Okay, I mean, I actually have uploaded my raw data to gedmatch.com, mostly because they have an admixture page where you can plug your data into different, not search engines, but I don't know what you call them.
Algorithms, I guess. There are a number of different type of algorithms they use for that.
And I'd never actually considered the security aspect of that. I'd assumed that there were basically no risks to that process.
Yeah, it's you don't predict that there will be any problems, but you can't say for certain.
Okay. Hopefully nothing will happen.
Right.
And where do you feel that the general public is right now on their knowledge level of these genetic tests, and where do you think that we're going in the future? When will this become common knowledge for a majority of people?
Well, I think we're entering a genomic era where knowledge about our DNA is used to supplement other aspects of our life, especially the medical realm. I don't believe that we're approaching anything like a Gattaca situation where DNA is predictive of what we can do or what we will do, or limits us to what we can do. And that DNA just isn't as predictive as people thought. I think there was a time when everyone thought that you would get your DNA sequenced and the rest of your life would be mapped out. But research has shown that's just not the case. There's just too much environment involved that influences it. So as we enter this genomic era, people, I think, will have to learn more about genetics and about their DNA in order to be able to make informed decisions about what they can do, what they should do with their DNA. And as that happens, as people become more and more aware of the need for knowledge about genetics, I think knowledge of genetic genealogy tests will only benefit from that. Currently, there are thousands of people who have taken these tests, hundreds of thousands, and I think in the genealogical community, there is widespread knowledge of these tests, although the knowledge varies from an introductory level knowledge of what the test can do and what tests there are to very in-depth knowledge. So it's a whole spectrum, and I think there can never be enough education on that topic, which is why there's a continued need for people to give talks and for blogs and things to help people understand what these tests are and what they can do.
And for people who are interested in learning more, would you recommend any books? I was thinking of you have Brian Sykes as well as Spencer Wells, who have written books on the subject.
Yes, those are both great sources. Their books, you can Google either of their names and you'll get more information about their books. They're both entertaining authors. There's also a book by famous genealogist Megan Smoleniak, and co-authored by a physician, Ann Turner. And that's really was the first book about genetic genealogy for the average genealogist. That's still in print and still very widely read. There's also the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, or ISOG, as it's known. And that's a free organization with a mailing list you can join and other resources to help you understand genetic genealogy testing. So there's a number of sources online for people to learn more.
I'd like to thank you for talking to us here today, Blaine.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for having me.
It was great. Great chance to hear more about a subject that I've been interested in for years now.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thanks for talking.